Good evening and welcome to the next in our series of heritage lectures on the Our Town Hall project. I'm Paul Candeland, I'm the project director, the chap that was talking so loudly on the film there. And it's a great pleasure to host these heritage lectures. What these are all about really is sharing with as many people as possible the detail of some of the fabulous work that's going on within the Town Hall. And the reason we're really keen to do that is because a lot of that work behind the scenes is in such finite detail that when we open the doors at the end of the project and we bring people back into the building, to the untrained eye, in many cases, that work will not be obvious or even visible. So we're taking the opportunity to tell that invisible story with these lectures, and we're bringing the specialists, the artisan craftspeople, the specialist suppliers, and all of the guys and girls that are doing all this phenomenal work for us into this environment to share with you their particular stories about what it is they're doing and why they're doing it. And the subject of this evening's talk is the Town Hall organ. Built in 1877, when the Town Hall first opened, by Aristide Cavay-Cole, potentially perhaps the greatest organ builder of his time. It stood centre stage in the Great Hall ever since, right the way through to 2015, when with some condition survey, looking at the state of the organ, we determined that it really did need some serious work to bring it back to its former glory. And that part of the project is a real feature for us. When we bring the organ back and it's revoiced, it will once again take centre stage in the Great Hall at the heart of our Town Hall. The work is being undertaken by two partners, Nicholson and Co. of Malvern, and Flentrop Ergelbouw from the Netherlands. And we're really privileged this evening to have Andrew Caskey, the Managing Director of Nicholson & Co., to talk to us about the work that they're doing. Just to put it into some historical context, the organ cost at the time £2,500 to build, which we reckon would be about £2.5 million now. So every penny that we're spending on the organ now to bring it back to its former glory with money very, very well spent. So sit back and enjoy the talk. There'll be a bit of time at the end for you to ask questions and engage with Andrew, but I'm going to invite Andrew to the stage now and let him tell us all about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you for coming. I hope that seeing you here represents the interest that people have in this wonderful instrument and in the project. Just to give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about, we'll start with a bit of background. Why is there an organ in the Town Hall? A bit of the history of the instrument, consideration of what was the right way forward for this particular organ, and then talking about the work we did to dismantle it, and then the various design and research work that we've had to do, the restoration work that is ongoing at the moment, and finished, and the work that lies ahead as well. So it's perhaps useful to start by just reminding ourselves of the sheer extravagance, really, of the Town Hall building. Can you imagine in 2023 a brief being given to an architect to say that they wanted a building to be equal, if not superior, to any similar building in the country at any cost which may be reasonably required? Quite extraordinary, but that is why you have such an exceptional building, and so many parts of the building, including the organ, were literally the best that money could buy anywhere in the world at the time. Here's a lovely old picture of the hall in its early days. So let's go inside the hall. We've entered the main entrance, into the sculpture gallery on the ground floor, and then we go up the grand staircase, and we find ourselves on the Bees Gallery. And then these doors off the gallery lead us into the Great Hall. I think it's worth just noting the vision of the City Fathers at the time to bring culture and the arts to the people of Manchester. On a Saturday afternoon, when you'd finished your half-day shift in a factory somewhere, you could come to the Town Hall for no cost, and you could admire the sculptures in the hall. You could then come up to the Great Hall and admire the Manchester murals that depicted scenes of the history of the city. You could look up at the ceiling and marvel at all the different cities and countries that Manchester traded with. And then, of course, at the end of the hall, you could listen to an organ recital. Extraordinary provision of culture for people. Now, you might well be sitting there thinking, well, why is there an organ in the town hall? I thought you only find organs in churches and cathedrals. And part of the reason why there was an organ there is to do with the availability of recorded, or the absence of recorded music in the 19th century, and the opportunities people had to go and hear live music. There were, of course, no record players, or CDs, or YouTube, or Spotify, and so opportunities to hear some of the major pieces in the classical and choral repertoire were limited for many people. An orchestra is expensive in manpower, as is potentially a choral concert. And so a tradition, a peculiarly British tradition, grew up of having these civic organs in civic halls around Britain. One of the first was St George's Hall in Liverpool, where the organist of the day, William Thomas Best, over a 40-year period, gave hundreds and hundreds of recitals. And at the end of his career, he said that he himself had personally arranged and played everything from the classical and choral repertoire that he felt was worth arranging for the organ and playing it. So just to be clear, this is not music written for the organ. This is music written for an orchestra or written for a choir to sing, which has then been arranged to be played as an organ solo. This is an interesting example. This is a review of an early recital in the town hall. And without going through piece by piece, what's really striking in the list of music that is played is that there's only one piece in there that is proper organ music. Everything else is an arrangement for the organ of pieces written for other forms originally. Some months ago, I was complaining to another organ builder of mine that the only two recitals, recordings that I could find of the Manchester organ were of lighter, entertaining music, like you might hear on a cinema organ. And I was rightly rebuked by my colleague who said, but this organ was designed to provide music to entertain and to, as well as educate. There are many civic organs. You might be able to identify some of these. This is Birmingham, and Huddersfield, and the Royal Albert Hall in London, and Leeds Town Hall. And so Manchester Town Hall organ sits among a galaxy of these very fine civic organs in the 19th century. So getting back to Manchester, you may well be aware that the building was designed by the great architect Alfred Waterhouse. Now, organ builders and architects have a slightly awkward relationship because architects never appreciate just how much space an organ needs. This was Waterhouse's original sketch for both the size and appearance for how an organ might look in the town hall. First of all, it's far too small, but secondly, its ratio of height, width, and depth is unlike any organ I've ever seen. It would never quite have worked. The corporation had to go out and find an organ builder. There were a number of Manchester firms at the time. Here's some of them. In fact, I was on the way up this morning, I was inspecting an organ by another Manchester firm of the time. But that wasn't good enough. They could have looked further afield and gone for a national firm. Just some years earlier, our firm's founder, John Nicholson, had built a brand new organ for Manchester Cathedral. But that wasn't good enough either. And so Manchester wanted the best organ in the world. And that was partly influenced by what had happened just a few years earlier up the road in Sheffield, where the Albert Hall, which was completed in 1873, with similar aspirations, had gone to a French organ builder. Can you imagine going abroad for an organ in the height of the Victorian era? But that's what they did because that was rightly regarded as where you could find the best instrument. The firm they went to was a Parisian organ builder called Aristide Cavaillé. And he is acknowledged then and now as a great genius, both in terms of the artistry and the musical beauty he brought to his instruments, but also for his engineering prowess. He built many famous organs, such as those in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris and Saint-Sulpice. And what was it that made him so effective? Well, thinking about him from the artistic point of view, he built organs that sounded like no others. And I mean that as a compliment. He developed a whole new sound world of organs that sounded different from any other instrument, so much so that they really inspired a whole number of composers to start writing music for the organ because these sounds were so enchanting. Very warm, romantic, and expressive sounds. Some particular features of it, we'll hear little clips now. The first one is a type of organ pipe called a flute harmonique, and it sounds very much like an orchestral flute, as if somebody was playing in the room. You could imagine someone sitting in the hall playing a flute. But he also developed very warm foundational sounds, which we call the fond dorg. Those lovely quiet sounds are really enchanting, but Cavaillé-Coll organs are also very exciting when they're played loud. And one of the things that really makes them arrest your attention is the very powerful reed sounds, which we'll hear on this little video. Now, compared to any British organ of the period, that's a much more exciting, vivid, brilliant, perhaps slightly thinner sound than many British organs of the time. From an engineering perspective, Cavaillé-Coll was also a genius. One of the things that had plagued organ building in the 19th century was that as instruments got larger and larger, they were getting heavier and heavier to play. Mendelssohn visited Birmingham to visit the new town hall organ in the 1830s and pronounced the organ to be unplayable because it was so heavy. An Englishman called Charles Barker invented a machine that lightened the touch on these very heavy organs. But unfortunately, no English organ builders were interested. And it took a French organ builder, Cavaillé-Coll, to spot the genius. And he adopted this. And it was a massive part of his success in building these large, generously winded organs that were still very comfortable to play. He was also a real... he helped organists change the volume and the colour of the sound in dramatic ways. And that's part of what inspired composers. And his organs were therefore, they sounded different. And in terms of the accessories beyond the keyboards and the pedals, the means that the organist had to change the colour and the volume, they were unique. And that was partly something that caused the Manchester organ to be changed later, which we'll come on to. He was a real polymath. He also took out a patent on a version of a bandsaw, an extraordinary man. If you are interested in knowing any more about Cavaillé-Coll, there is a recent DVD box set of 5 DVDs which tells you everything you might want to know. It's worth looking out. The Manchester organ was the 9th and final instrument that Cavaillé-Coll exported to Britain. It started with a small church in Kensington. One of the men who went to hear that organ was a a Lancashire barrister called John Hopwood. And he liked the Cavaillé-Coll organ sound so much that he decided to commission an organ for his flat in London, as you do. And he liked it so much that he then had decided to commission another Cavaillé-Coll organ for his country seat, as you do. And this really led to the popularity of his instruments. Many of them, sadly, have been either lost or rebuilt beyond recognition. The only two that remain in anything approaching their original form is the organ built for Hopwood's country home, which is now in the Power Hall in Warrington, albeit quite substantially altered, and the organ in Manchester Town Hall, again fairly substantially altered, but we'll come back to that in a moment. So let's go back to Waterhouse's sketch. Well, we don't know what Cavaillé-Coll thought of this sketch, but probably not a lot. And this was his response, suggesting a completely different design of case. Waterhouse was clearly realised that he was in the presence of a genius and amended his ideas and developed Cavaillé-Coll's drawing into a sketch of a totally different case design. And this is starting to look a bit more like the Manchester organ as we know it. Two things are worth noting. First of all, the console, where the player sits, this box at the lower part of the image. It's distinctive compared to other organs of the time because it's detached, it's not actually connected to the organ itself, and it's reversed. So the player has their back to the instrument and they're looking out into the hall. Now, hitherto, there were only other than Cavaillé-Coll organs. Nobody had ever done that before. It was quite an exceptional thing. The other thing that I think really makes this case so successful are these steep staircases going up either side, which really give a sense of elegance and height to the casework design. Paul mentioned earlier on that the organ cost £2,700. This is a copy of the contract between Manchester Corporation and Cavaillé-Coll. Interestingly, the tender was in pounds rather than francs. And so the organ was completed for the new hall in 1877. And there's a drawing and a photograph of it. If you look at these three windows on the right-hand side of the image, that was what was known as the organist's retiring room. I think every organ should have one of them. And this is where the city organist was able to relax before a concert, perhaps having a cigar, who knows, and looking out the window, and at the appointed hour would put their cape on and then sweep down these staircases at the side onto the stage. A really exciting way to make an entrance. Space was so tight in the chamber, because not enough space had been left for an organ, that part of the instrument had to be installed outside the chamber. This is behind the organ, and in a corridor running behind the organ, a kind of mezzanine cupboard that's very long and thin had to be formed. And in there is all the apparatus that raises the wind for the organ, because it couldn't be fitted into the chamber. Well, the organ was inaugurated in 1877 to glowing reviews, but it's worth highlighting one observation that was made. I'm sorry, this is a bit small, so I've got to use this microphone to read part of it. Of the organ, we're able to speak in terms of almost unalloyed praise. The foundation stops are rich and mellow in tone, possessing a quality hitherto supposed to be attainable only by age. Skipping on a bit, while the reeds, the crucial tests of an organ builder's skill display an evidence of an evenness of voicing and a promptitude of utterance which we have rarely heard equalled. And this is the interesting bit. The only great fault we can find with the instrument is a want of balance of power to the full organ. The pedal organ and the foundation work on the great organ, though most excellent in tone, are scarcely of sufficient weight to counterbalance the seven-rank mixture. That's a high-pitched stop. The very admirable items fail to combine for grand effect. Now, that is a really interesting observation, and it's suggesting that the organ is a bit bass-light. Now, I mentioned earlier on when we heard that video that Cavaillé-Coll organs were a quite different sound from a British instrument. Was the reviewer that informed? Was he commenting that this organ was bass-light in comparison to other Cavaillé organs? Or was he just comparing it with the kind of roast beef and Yorkshire pudding sound that was much more familiar to English ears? We'll never know. The great and good came to play the instrument. Here's a recital program by Alexandre Guillemot, and many others, such as Saint-Saëns and Gigoux, Louis Vierne, all came. These were the celebrities of the day. But remembering that whole comment in the original review, some 16 years after the organ was completed, Cavaillé was invited to return to the hall to make some additions. And in 1893, he enlarged the instrument slightly. He added some extra bass pipes to give the organ a bit more foundation and weight to the bottom of its sound. And he also found room inside the organ for another family of pipes of a particular solo quality. And the console, where the player sits, which had originally had 3 keyboards, had to be extended to 4. The problem, although he found space inside the organ for that extra family of solo pipes, some changes had to be made to the organ's appearance to fit the extra pedal pipes. And if you'll examine these 2 photographs carefully, you'll see the difference. On the photo on the right, the staircases have disappeared. You see that? And that's because to create a really low sound, you have to have a very long organ pipe. The longer the pipe, the lower the note. And of course, they take up a lot of space. And there was no opportunity to take the whole organ out. It was only 16 years old. So the only space that could be found was by removing those staircases, blanking them off, and putting those big pipes in where they'd been. And although they certainly improved the tonal versatility of the instrument, I think you could safely say that they slightly marred its appearance. There's a painting of the organ after they were of those alterations. At that time, there was a constant pressure to modernize organs. There was we must bring them up to date and improve it. And that's because they didn't really respect at the time that so many instruments, their integrity comes from when they are in original condition. And so there was an insatiable desire to change things. And it's really interesting reading press reviews at the time, how quickly the mood changes from the pride in 1870s of having gone to the world's best and probably the world's most expensive organ builder, to by 1900, there's a sense of, yeah, it's a bit different. Why can we not have an organ like every other town hall? And in the 1890s, there was somebody wrote to The Guardian complaining, why are all the lunchtime recitals in the town hall given by one man? Wouldn't it be great if we had some variety? And another organist who obviously wanted to remain anonymous wrote this letter. He said, having had considerable experience of organs, both in this and other countries, and having myself frequently given recitals on the organ in the Albert Hall, Crystal Palace, Alexandra Palace, and other large public buildings, generally with an hour or so of previous practice, I unhesitatingly declare that the Manchester Town Hall organ is an instrument upon which I would not attempt to play to an audience without at least a month's study of its resources. Quite a statement. And great names such as Sir Walter Parrott, who was one of the great organists of the day, he came to grief on the Manchester organ. He could play the notes fine, but what he was struggling with was some of the particularly distinctive means of controlling the organ that Cavaillé had invented. This picture here is not of the Manchester console, but of the Albert Hall in Sheffield, which was the console would have been virtually identical. And you might look at it and think, well, what's different about it from any other organ console? It's got keyboards and stops. Well, it does, but if you were a Mancunian in 1900, you might not have been quite so familiar with the French terminology, and you certainly wouldn't have understood what some of these gadgets were doing, because they were so new and unfamiliar at the time. So there were key differences. This is the only known photograph showing the keyboards side of the original Manchester console. A very poor photograph, but it is nonetheless important to have. And that is Kendrick Pine, the first city organist, sitting there playing it. And remember, he's got his back to the instrument and he's looking out into the hall. Well, matters came to a head in the 1910s, and the organ was thoroughly rebuilt in 1912 in probably its most significant intervention. And you could describe in one word all that work as an Anglicization of the instrument, basically turning it from something distinctive and unusual into something that's much more familiar, but in practice was much more run-of-the-mill. This was done by the London firm of Lewis and Company, who by then were past their heyday. I mentioned earlier on that the organ chamber was already very cramped, but yet they managed to increase the number of pipes from about 3,900 to over 5,000. And some of the voicing of the pipes was changed, some of the mechanism was replaced, and a new console was fitted within the existing carcass on the stage. And I think you could truthfully say that this turned an unusual but beautiful French masterpiece into a run-of-the-mill English town hall organ. There's a picture of the 1912 console. Any organist of the day would have sat down and thought, well, yes, this is all very impressive because of its size, but they would also have felt immediately at home in terms of knowing what everything did, in the way that perhaps at that time they weren't so comfortable sitting on a Cavaillé call console. But it's very interesting in this review of the opening recital after the 1912 work. At a first hearing, our impression was that the additions are by no means a clear gain, and that as yet they do not all prove perfect in their working. They add very much apparently to the power of the full organ and make many effects possible that were not possible before. But the organ was never one for powerful combinations, but was rather remarkable for the individual beauty of the stops in separate use or in small groupings. The increase of power seems to be gained somewhat at the loss of clearness, and in the fuller combination, the poise and focusing of the tone to the ear seems somewhat impaired in their beauty. And possibly a little further working will banish some of the apparent confusion of effect, but for the present time, we are not confident that the original clarity and beauty of the organ can be retained or will be equalled in the newer parts of the organ. So the work is barely finished and the contract paid for, and there are already thoughts, have we made a mistake in altering this organ? But the pressure to modernize and improve kept going. Only 16 years later, the console was upgraded to bring modern accessories in. It's interesting to see how there are loads of references to the organ in the press in the late 19th century, all sorts of interesting letters about people complaining about other people walking in late, and people complaining about people smoking at the front when they should have been only smoking at the back. It's another world. But and then it was used quite frequently for broadcasts on the radio in the 1920s and 30s. But then after the Second World War, mention of the organ in the press virtually disappears. The next phase of work on the instrument happened in 1970, when the Manchester firm of Jardine underdid some work. Further modernisation. And this was really introducing electricity into the mechanism of the organ. And they even managed to find room to squeeze yet more pipes in into the already cramped chamber. Perhaps the biggest change was that the introduction of electricity allowed the console on the stage, which was fixed and permanent, to be discarded and replaced with a new console on a wheeled platform on the hall floor, which you could move around. And it was attached by a big umbilical cord. And if you compare these three pictures, showing how the organ has looked over the years. In the left-hand picture, that's how the organ looked between 1877 and 1893, so when it was brand new. The middle picture is how it looked from 1893 until 1970. And then the picture on the right is how it looked from 1970 onwards. And I think you could safely say that the appearance of the organ has been progressively spoiled by these changes, and particularly the loss of the visual focal point of the console. If you compare that picture on the left, the lovely sense of height from those staircases and the elegance, and has been transformed into what looks like a dumpy row of pipes sitting atop a wooden screen. We'll come back to that later on. The situation before the organ was dismantled a couple of years ago It was in very poor condition. Much of the leather dated from at least 1912, if not 1877. Many of the wooden components had split. It was absolutely filthy inside. Some of the metal pipes in particular were collapsing, lots of wind leaks. But as well as its poor condition, it had also lost its way tonally. It wasn't speaking with its original French accent, but neither had it been successfully converted to speaking with an English accent. It was a bit of both. And from a mechanical point of view, it was far too overcomplicated by all these additions and just lacking in integrity. And you couldn't get to anything to maintain it. Here are some pictures of the organ interior just before dismantling, just showing how dirty it was. Look at the dust on there, and pipes collapsing, state-of-the-art magnets from 1970. And then here you've got, in the original Cavaillé oak wind trunks, which have been painted green in 1970. And then you've got flexible plastic hose sticking out of them. You've got leather with patches on it, just general filth everywhere. This was the 1970 console on the hall floor, and then you had more collapsing pipes. And I think this picture really epitomizes the confused state of the organ. In the center of the picture, you have that green concertina trunk, which dates from 1877. That was Cavaillé. The lighter timber component going away from the camera, that's 1912, mechanism by Lewis. And it's being fed by a 1970 plastic hose. And it just summarizes in one picture how utterly confused the instrument had become. And yet, despite all that confusion and despite its poor condition, you could still sense some of the original beauty and quality. On this next slide is a short video taken on the day that the organ was turned off for the last time. And although, to my ears, it's an organ saying, "Please turn me off," you can still hear hints of the lovely French quality to what we call the stringy and fluty sounds of the organ. To anybody familiar with different styles of organ construction, they'll felt immediately as if they've been transported to France, hearing those sounds. Well, there was a major decision faced by the council what to do with the instrument. And there are a number of options. It could have just been abandoned, leave for another day to sort. It was really beyond patching up. That wasn't a credible possibility. It would, in theory, have been possible to restore it to good condition without making any alterations, so effectively leaving it as altered in 1970, but returning it to good condition. But there wasn't really an appetite for that because it was so confused tonally and so confused mechanically. One could also argue, well, it's been on a journey, let's keep that journey going. Let's bring it into the 21st century and replace much of the mechanism with new, and redevelop it. That's what we're doing presently in the organ at Leeds Town Hall. It's very much the right decision there, and it's very much the wrong decision at Manchester. And one could also have argued, well, let's just scrap it and build a brand new organ. But finally, and I think wholeheartedly, the correct decision was made in Manchester that to restore the original integrity of the organ by putting it back to how its builder left it. So not just back into good condition, but back into original condition. And that means in practice reversing the alterations of 1970 and reversing the alterations of 1912. And you might think, well, why do that? Why is that important? And I think it's important just to realise that an organ is more than just a tuned noise machine. And for it to work as a musical instrument, a really beautiful thing that's being created, there has to be a real consistency and cohesion between its mechanism, its appearance, its sound, and all that has to be of one, and for an organ to have integrity. And so the vision at Manchester is to put the organ back to how Cavaillé left it in 1893 after he enlarged it. But we have one trick up our sleeve. I mentioned earlier on that when he added those pipes in 1893, he didn't have the opportunity to take the organ out. We do. And it means that those pipes that were added where the staircases were, we can put them at the back of the organ chamber, which means that we've got the best of both worlds. We can return the organ to its augmented 1893 specification, but to its original 1877 appearance. And so it will look exactly like that, with the staircases recreated and the detached reversed console, but it will have all the pipes that Cavaillé built, including his later additions. Well, it was obviously important to choose an organ builder. This is a project and an instrument of international significance. There were conversations had with lots of firms from across the world, and we were very privileged to be appointed. And we decided to team up with respected colleagues from a Dutch firm, Flentrop, who are based outside Amsterdam. We were both interested in doing this project, but kind of had second thoughts about doing it on our own, because it's a very big and very technically challenging project, and two heads are better than one. And we were both much happier with the idea of sharing the expertise and the work. We're based in Malvern. You might not think that from my accent, but we are, down in Worcestershire. We've been going for nearly 200 years. We have 25 staff, and we're still building new organs and doing lots of historical restoration and a bit of everything in between. And our colleagues in Flentrop are doing much the same. Similar size, they're based just outside Amsterdam. So let's talk through the restoration work that we're doing. Well, the first challenge we have, you could describe what we've got to do in three sections. First of all, the easy bit is to strip out all the non-original additions. That's done and straightforward. Some of that was done when we dismantled the organ. The next bit, which is significant in scale, but relatively straightforward, is to restore all the original Cavaillé material that remains. But the most challenging part is to build brand new, in a period style, the mechanism that was lost in 1912. We can't go to some archive and blow off some dusty drawings and, this is how it was. They don't exist. So we've got to come up with a design, and that design has to be based on lots of evidence and research. So when we dismantled the organ, we were dismantling it intentionally slowly, because we were looking for lots of clues as to where there might have been components screwed in and so on. And we made lots and lots of diagrams, and you can see some of them there during the dismantling. And that really set the boundaries for our design that then had to be developed further. People are always astonished at just how much space a dismantled organ takes up. We turned up in August 2020 to take the organ out, and eventually there was a huge scaffold built to help lift some of the large, heavy components out. This was the first of the 5,083 pipes coming out, and you can see that there was lots of vacuuming that happened along the way, but not all of the dust got picked up, and some of it got where it shouldn't have. And then there were lots of challenges to try to identify, now, is this Cavaillé, or is this for the skip, or is this not sure, we need to take that away and look at it. And so there were lots of careful consideration as we were taking the organ apart. lots of pipes quite badly damaged, having to be carefully removed. And that is just a snapshot of some of the material removed from the organ. Lots of labelling of everything and lots of making drawings on site. I mentioned that we were looking for clues during the dismantling, and this is a really good example of one of the discoveries. If you look at that green, horrible green paint, above that, can you see a silhouette of lighter timber in a kind of triangle shape? We all shouted Eureka when we saw that, because that was the silhouette for a component called a rollerboard. I don't expect anyone to know what a rollerboard is. It's immaterial, really, but it was so helpful to us, because we knew there would be one of them somewhere, but we weren't entirely sure whether it would be halfway back in the organ chamber or on the back wall. And so, despite the fact that that component had not been there for a century, you could still see where it had been. And that was really helpful for informing our design. And we found another one. You can see the lighter paint there. So the design that we've had to come up with for the reconstructed parts of the organ is bounded by those clues and evidence that we found during the dismantling. But taking that specific example, okay, we know that there was a rollerboard there. What we don't know is, well, was it the rods attached to that, were they 4 millimeters in diameter or 5 or 6? And so that level of detail we've had to populate by going to copy surviving unaltered Cavaillé-Coll organs. Sadly, most of them are in France. It's a hard life. We've had to. So that design is really bounded by the clues we found, and then the detail is found by copying surviving examples elsewhere. I hope you follow what I mean. So the organ started to come down. That's taking the frame down at the top, and then this was in the tunnel at the back. You can see the grime in there. Some very large components coming out. And then gradually the walls of the organ chamber began to reveal themselves. That's me on the left, and in the middle is my colleague Eric Winkle, who is the managing director of Flintrop. We found lots of interesting markings on the pipes, which were all noted down and recorded. And you can see close up the beautiful casework, albeit covered in dust. Adorning the top of the case was this lovely young lady, and we discovered on closer examination that she had an air rifle pellet in her, which there must have been pigeons in the hall at one point. That's been repaired. But it's really interesting, despite the fact that this is 40 foot up in the air, the quality of the carving on this sculpture is beautiful, even on the back, that only the organ tuner would ever see. It's really quite something. And there's some of the casework coming down. This is a really interesting photograph. This is taken inside the organ, looking out into the hall against the side wall on one. And you can see the row of the tops of metal pipes. That was the original side facade of the organ, looking onto the staircase. Everybody see what I mean? And you can see those green pipes that are in there, and they're the pipes that Cavaillé-Coll added in 1893, where there had been staircases. And those are the pipes that we are moving to the back to allow us to recreate the staircases and to re-expose those side facades that have been hidden since 1893. The casework started to come off, and you can see here that the challenge we had, all this green paint put on in 1970, was only put where they could reach. And you can see on these pipes that they're still largely red. Eventually we got down to almost floor level, and we got at last to the stage where the organ chamber was completely empty for the first time since 1877. And the organ in a dismantled form filled 6 lorries and 3 vans and 2 skips. Quite an extraordinary amount of stuff. Now, restoration of the organ is a major project, but it's not as major as restoring the whole town hall. And the council rightly wanted the organ out at the start to protect it, and doesn't want it back until the end to protect it. And so for a time, the dismantled organ had to go into storage. And we could only find one place in the UK that could store the entire organ in dismantled form in carefully controlled humidity and temperature surroundings. That was down in Sussex, near Brighton. And that's the organ where it was down there. And just to give you an idea of some of the scale, there's one of my colleagues next to some of the largest pipes. And eventually, it was time to get it out of storage, and half of it came to our workshop in Malvern, and the other half went across to Amsterdam, and it's being worked on in both places at the moment. I mentioned earlier on that there are no drawings of the Manchester organ to call on. It's quite frustrating because there are drawings for Cavaillé organs up to 1875, 2 years before Manchester, but all the Cavaillé archives from 1875 onwards have been lost for decades. No one knows where they are. But the earlier drawings are very helpful. This is a drawing of the 1873 Sheffield organ, showing the cross-section of the console, and then that pink vertical line is the casework, and everything on the right of that is inside the organ. And you can see running under the organist's feet, going back into the organ, the little wooden rods, which we call trackers, which join the keys to the valves under the pipes. I mentioned earlier on this machine by an Englishman called Mr. Barker that helped lighten the touch. And on the extreme right of that diagram is one of several Barker machines. And we've got to reconstruct 3 of them for the Manchester organ. Although there were no extant drawings for Manchester, there was some archive information that was really helpful. This is a workshop book listing the size of many soundboards in the Cavaillé workshop, and you might just be able to make out Manchester, Manchester, Manchester in different places. And this was really helpful for the restoration. One thing that we were able to do was to create a 3D model of the organ. This is particularly helpful for us to be able to work out the design and make sure that things aren't going to clash, and we can spin it around and look at it from lots of different angles. And it's been particularly helpful, for example, to prove our concept of being able to move those 1893 pipes to the back of the organ. And you can see them in that diagram there, not clashing with the staircases. Once we started work in the workshop, we had a number of tests to do to prove various restoration theories methodologies that we wanted to use. We had to get all that 1970 green paint off, but we wanted ideally to get it off without destroying the paint underneath, because it was original. And we found that some of the organ had originally been painted red, and with the right kind of paint stripper, we were able to get the green off, absolutely no problem. Although it was a good time to take shares out and paint stripper. But then some of the organ had been painted yellow, and we could not get the green off without destroying the yellow. And so those parts have had to be repainted in yellow. We also had to take apart various stages of intervention on the organ, trying to suss out the really detailed history of the alterations that have been made. Very intriguingly, we're sometimes thrown awry by, would you believe it, manufacturing mistakes that have been covered up. So 2 of the components in the organ were actually made with 1 note extra by mistake. And it's really interesting. These things can throw you. And in the workshop book, you can see that Cavaillé realised the mistake and scored it out and put a new number in. And taking layers off different chests. And that's a picture of some of our team in Rouen in France, after crawling around, taking lots of measurements of the action that we're copying for the Manchester organ. So going into some of the practical work that's happening, there will be just under 4,000 pipes in the organ when it comes back, so as it was. Although the pipes were very dirty, and there were some collapsing metal pipes, in large part, the pipes were still fairly well preserved. We've got lots of green paint to strip off the wooden ones, and then all the pipes will get cleaned, they'll get repaired, and then they have to get their speech checked and make sure that they're all speaking properly. If you imagine, if you're a choir, I'd like you to all to blend, and no voices to stick out, or be a bit louder than all the others. And it's that process of evening out and making sure that everything is speaking not as we think best. We're not trying to impose our musical personality on the organ, but what we think Cavaillé intended. And it's really important that as organ builders doing a historical restoration, we're always putting ourselves subservient to the original organ builder and saying, well, what did they intend? It may not have been the way that we would do things, but what was intended here? When the pipes are back in the organ, we then do a final tuning and regulation, making sure that everything is speaking properly in the hall. You see some of the amount of paint to come off there. Here are some of the pipes being repaired. On the left, these pipes are only about the size of a pencil, and you can see some of the shinier ones, which are new replacements in a matching style, because some of the very small ones have been missing or damaged beyond repair. And on the right is one of my colleagues, Calvin, repairing one of the facade pipes, one of the pipes visible in the case. And one of the unique challenges we have in the town hall that we don't normally face in churches is how do we get nicotine stains off the pipes? In case you're interested, the answer is hot water and dishwasher tablets. It works very well. And then there's some of the green paint coming off some of the larger pipes. Some of the pipes had also had their pitch altered by chopping them down in length. And you can see some very large pipes here being reformed to their original length. And then these are some of the pipes repainted back to their original yellow. Here's a metal pipe with a replacement ear on the mouth, which just helps it to get straight onto its note. And the pipe on the right, you can see a shiny ring where it's been cut to repair it and then resoldered. So again, just making them all absolutely structurally true. And then once they're all cleaned and repaired, they then go through the process of having their speech adjusted and checked in the workshop. In the 1912 work, the organ's pitch was lowered. Standard concert pitch for instruments has varied up and down over the centuries, and when this organ was built, it was quite sharp. And in the 1912, that was brought down to what's present-day concert pitch, although present-day it's actually rising again slightly. And this picture here illustrates why it's really important to put that pitch back to where it was. Remember I said earlier on that the longer an organ pipe, the lower the note? Cavaillé liked to make a lot of his pipes over length and then cut slots in them. You can just see the bits of slots in there. And that gives them a particularly stringy, almost slightly keen and acidic sound, which really captures the ear. And these pipes are tuned by moving these colours up and down. And by lowering the pitch, these colours have been moved so far up that they're covering virtually all of the slot. So that as well as changing the pitch, they have changed the timbre of the pipes, which we really don't want to do. And by reopening those slots back to the original length, yes, the organ will get sharper in pitch again, but it will be returned to its original tonal character. Another example here, some of the pipes have little brass tongues which vibrate, like in a clarinet, and Cavaillé never put these loads on the end of the tongues. This was done in the 1912 work because there was a sense that the French sound was too exciting and in your face, and let's make it smoother and much more refined by putting these loads on. These have all got to come off to return the original tonality. One of the really interesting alterations that we have to make to some of the pipes is right at the top and the front of the organ. And there were the pipes that were added in 1893 at the top, not at the sides. They were actually, some of them were horizontal, like the pipes on the right in that picture there. This is a Spanish influence. Often in Spain, these horizontal pipes are actually sticking out the front of the organ. But Cavaillé liked this, but quite often did it inside the organ, not for visual effect, but just for tonal effect, because it gives a really directional quality to the sound doing that, and it makes it sound very different. But again, that was a bit unrefined to 1912 ears, and those pipes were moved up to vertical and just put a little hood on the top. And that's me looking far too excited. In the Sacré-Cœur organ in Paris, taking lots of detailed measurements to copy that framework and that structure exactly, so that those pipes on the left, which is how the Manchester ones looked when we took them out, so that when they go back into the hall, they will look and be arranged like the ones on the right. Well, let's move on to the casework and the building frame of the organ. Lots of green paint to be removed and lots of damage to put right. You can see on the left there was a component in the organ that was supported by 4 legs. One of them had gone missing and the component was sagging, and the other 3 had been painted green. We've stripped the paint from them and made a matching replacement. We've also done some trial assembly to make sure all the bits are there, and then the bits that had been painted green over yellow have been repainted yellow. Some of the pipes in the organ, again this is all hidden to the people in the hall, are enclosed in 2 very large wooden boxes. And on the front and side of those boxes are louvres, like Venetian blinds, that can be opened and closed by the organist. And all that mechanism has had to be restored. And you can see some of those shutter mechanisms being restored there. We've also recovered the edge of the shutters in cloth and horsehair to match exactly what was done originally. That gives a really good acoustic seal when the shutters are closed. And then, of course, the major part of the work on the casework is to reopen those arches and recreate the staircases so that the organ will look as it did when it was new. Let me just get a mouthful of water. One of the most sensitive and difficult parts of the restoration is on the very large components that we call soundboards and chests. And these are very large wooden components. They look a bit like this. And there are about 11 of these of that size and about a similar number of smaller ones. And these are what the pipes sit on. And as you can see there, with the cover off, they're all divided into little internal wooden compartments. You can imagine that after 140 years of the heating going on and off and on and off and on and off, glue joints fail, the wood warps, it doesn't quite go back to the original shape, and wind is spilling over from one chamber into the next and leaking out where it shouldn't. So all that has to be trued up and repaired. And this is a picture of one of the soundboards going through very careful restoration. This is the first time that this has ever been done to these soundboards. And this is Tacitus, one of the guys in Flintrop, putting some leather into the soundboards to help preserve them and make them more robust in the future to withstand changes in humidity in the hall. In our restoration work, we have come to recognise what we call the Manchester smell. When you open up any component that hasn't been opened for 140 years, that's what it looks like inside. It's quite sobering to think of the air quality that people were breathing in industrial Victorian and Edwardian Manchester. And all this soot is sticky. Once it's on your hands, you have to wash them 3 times, and your hands are still black. And it really has a distinctive odour. Somebody asked me at the lunchtime talk, did we offer this to the university to get analysed? What a good idea. But perhaps we might have been quarantined if we had. But all this leather has been replaced with new, and it's all nice and shining and white now. This is another of the soundboards being restored. And this is just an example of how they looked when they arrived in our workshop. A particular challenge has been the soundboards for the pedal pipes, which run front to back along the sides of the organ. And in 1912, these had been cut lengthways. This was originally about twice the width that it is. And we've got to put that back to its original size. And remember that table I showed you from the Cavaillé workshop book? That was gold dust because it had the original dimensions on it. And so we were able to tell exactly how large that was once. And so we've done some trial assembly in the workshop to work out just how much space there is. And then we've mapped out the pipes to go back on there. And then on the right, you can see new pedal soundboards being made in exactly matching style back to the original dimensions that were in the workshop book. And some pipe blocks being restored. That's them after on the right. That they're ready to go back in. On any organ, the mechanism that converts the player's pressing of a key into a valve open underneath the pipe opening to allow wind in, that mechanism we call the action. Now, when the organ was built in 1877, all of the action was entirely mechanical. So hundreds of little wooden rods, like you can see in that Sheffield picture, running from inside the console, under the player's feet, and into the organ. And all of that has to be reconstructed because that was all lost in 1912. And we have to build 3 of those machines, Barker machines, that lighten the touch of the keys. Here's an example in another organ. We call this Barker Street. You can see the 3 machines in a row, and this is what we will eventually have in Manchester. This next slide shows you a video close up of one of these Barker machines doing their work. Now, you might be thinking there, gosh, that's awfully loud, but that's what it's like when you're right next to it with the cover off. But that machine is doing all the grunt work. So all the finger is having to do is open a valve in that machine. And then when the valve is opened, those big leather bellows, which we call motors, they suddenly open, and attached to them is a wooden rod going off to the valve under the pipe. So it keeps the organ keys light to play, because you're only acting on that machine, and that machine then relays and does all the work for you. Really clever invention. And so we've started to make these 3 replica machines. That's David in our workshop, cutting out all the parts. These are all exact copies of a surviving one elsewhere. Lots of intricate parts. This is a little feature that just cone valve that slows down the last little bit of opening just to quieten them down so they don't slam open. This is a rollerboard, for example, I was mentioning earlier on, that has to be reconstructed. Here's a picture of one of the actions we went to copy, and here's some pictures of reconstructed action. That's another older one. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, hang on a minute, you've only mentioned 3 Barker machines, but there's 4 keyboards. And that's right. In 1893, when Cavaillé added that extra keyboard, there was no room to put more wooden rods in linking to that. So that extra division at the top, at the front, had to be on a different kind of mechanism. And that was done on what we call pneumatic action. So instead of moving wooden rods, the keys actually open a little valve. And then that sends a puff of air down long lead tubing, like the thickness of a drinking straw. That is not the air that goes into the pipe. It's just air that moves at the other end of a valve. And we call that pneumatic action. And this is a picture of another one in another organ. And lots of lead tubing running over there. The problem we've got is that Cavaillé hardly ever used pneumatic action. He was obviously forced to do it here because there was no other option. But that means that there is no surviving example anywhere of his pneumatic action to copy. And we've asked lots of French organ builders and colleagues across the world, and everybody's of one mind that there's not one that exists anywhere. So what do? We've got lots of examples to copy for the rest of the organ, but for this particular keyboard, what do we do? Well, again, like the rest of the design, we work within the constraints and the boundaries that we have found during dismantling. And on the left here, uncovered after we peeled a rubber sheet off, you can see all these holes and silhouettes from the Cavaillé pneumatic action. And we've been able to work out from that, in large measure, how that action looked and how it operated. And the picture on the right is of a prototype that one of our team, David, has developed. Because before we set about building all this 61 times for each key, we want to be sure that our theory works. And in this next slide, you can see a video of this prototype in operation. I'll just pause it for a moment. On the bottom of the slide, picture, David's tapping a dummy keyboard, and then in the top of the picture you will see a leather motor closing and opening in response to the key. Just to remind you that there is no mechanical connection between them. Instead, there is 10 meters of thin hose. So this is proving this is all pneumatically actuated. And what we wanted to check here was, is it going to be responsive enough? And the answer is yes. So that's worked very successfully. And so we're now just getting started on making that for the whole keyboard. Well, organs use lots of wind, but it all has to be kept wind tight. The only place we want wind to come out is through pipes. We don't want it escaping through leaks and splits. And there's a huge amount of repair to be done to make the organ wind tight again. That's the state of some of the big bellows inside the organ. And this is them in the workshop with their old leather stripped off. This is one of our team, Luke, looking a bit bemused by what to do with this one. And you can see here on the left both the disintegration and the dirt on the leather, and on the right is the new leather being applied. One feature distinctive to Cavaillé-Coll's bellows and reservoirs is this green paper. It serves absolutely no practical purpose that we can see, but it looks very smart. The trouble is no one makes it anymore. And we've had to get it specially made in France. And it's embossed. It's quite hard to put on. If you don't press hard enough, you get lumps and bumps. And if you press too hard, you smooth out the embossed pattern. But we've developed the knack for putting it on. And you can see on the right some of the restored valves inside one of the reservoirs. And when we've finished re-leathering a reservoir, there are 14 in total to do, some of them about 3 meters long. The key moment arrives and we fill it with wind and see if it leaks. And you can see here this test pipe feeding in wind from the top, and the reservoir is sitting elevated because it's full of compressed air and it's dead silent. It's not going anywhere. So that's a successful test. And all the reservoirs get tested in that way to make sure they're completely silent and wind tight. You can see there on the left the state of some of the panels of the reservoirs. They weren't holding much wind. And on the right, in that instance, we've made new panels to match. You want to keep the wind steady and no fluctuations. On the left are two devices called concussions, and they just soak up any fluctuations. These are in unrestored state, albeit the one on the right we've stripped paint. Very interestingly, the leather hinges were lined with paper that we discovered was actually architectural drawings of the hall dated 1874. And that led us to wonder whether these concussions were actually fabricated on site by Cavaillé-Coll's team using whatever they could find. Because they perhaps found the wind a little unsteady and thought, we need one of these, let's make one. Really interesting discovery. And that's one of them being re-leathered, and then on the right, both of them finished and ready to go back into the organ. You can see here some more green paint being stripped off wind trunks, and then new leather joints inside all the timber to keep it totally airtight. One feature that Cavaillé-Coll loved, to the frustration of organ builders everywhere, was concertina trunks. Instead of solid timber, he often liked to save space by making a trunk that one bit would be fixed, at the top would be fixed, and the bottom would move up and down. Great idea, but they're a real pain to re-leather. And we have 13 of them to do on Manchester. And you can see here one of them being started. We've also got holes to fill in that are no longer needed. And Luke, one of our organ builders, has been doing nothing but concertina trunks for 5 months, and he's about 75% of the way through them. And you can see there the jig we've got to set up to do that. And then there is a completed example, looking as if it was, well, it is ready to come back straight into the organ. Nearly there. The final thing to talk about is the console. Now, the console is really, really important part of any organ. We have a saying in Malvern that you should be able to hear an organ simply by looking at the console before you've even turned it on. You might think, well, that's a daft thing to say, but I think there's some truth in it, that you should be able to sit in a very expensive car with the engine turned off and imagine what it's going to feel like to drive. And it's a similar concept. And the quality of the console, the style, it should tell something to the player and indeed the audience about what they're about to hear. So it's a really intrinsic part of the instrument. Remember that it's going to be back on the stage, permanently there, detached and reversed. It's also going to have the carved crest of the city of Manchester on it. A reminder that to the player it's going to look like this. This is the Albert Hall in Sheffield, but it will look virtually identical to that. We've done lots of the design work for the Manchester console, working out exactly where all the different rods for the action are going to go. Lots of discussions. 10:30 last night, we were all busy on WhatsApp, trying to agree the exact size of fonts to go on the drawstop. And the various arguments about where abbreviations, and on the one hand we've got pictures of Cavaillé consoles from somewhere in France, and on the other hand we've got about 5 different versions of the original stop list in Manchester. Journalists and people that wrote leaflets in the 1870s never in their wildest dreams thought that organ builders in the 2020s would be relying, was that hyphen intended? These are the kind of discussions that we have to get this just right. There's a 3D rendering of part of the console mechanism. And we've actually just got started this week on making some of the console, so that's about to start taking shape. And of course, it will not have our nameplate on it. Instead, it will have the nameplate of Cavaillé, the genius who built the organ in the first place. Just a word about the resources. Most of our staff in both firms are going to be involved. Some people are specialists. That's one of the things a larger organ building firm can offer. And some are general organ builders that turn their hand to most things. We've also got a staff exchange program so that any staff in one firm that think, I'd quite fancy doing a bit of what they're doing can experience that. And then it's also important to note the social values that are going to be brought to bear. We've got 7 work experience placements through the project. We've already done 4 of them. We've taken on a new apprentice, and we're also delivering career advice to schools, as well as doing lots of talks like this, because we love telling people about it. In terms of timescales, we dismantled the organ in the second half of 2020, and then it was in storage for about a year while we did lots of design development and research. And then we're now about 2/3 of the way through the restoration and reconstruction work in the workshops. And that will finish next year with a period of trial assembly where we put bits of the organ up in our workshop to test that it's all fitting together. We're actually putting the first part of the organ in next month. And that's the bit, all the portion that was in that tunnel at the back. It's lovely to see Wayne here, who's our man on the ground, who's making sure everything is just right for us. And so we're grateful to you for your help. And then the rest of the organ will come in the summer of next year and go through the detailed construction and commissioning phase. But eventually, the hall will be returned to have the organ as originally conceived by its genius organ builder, Cavaillé. It will return to its original appearance of 1877, and it will return to how the builder left it tonally in 1893. And if Monsieur Cavaillé was able to look down and see it, we very much hope that he will be pleased with the respect that his instrument has been given and the love and attention that's been lavished on it. Thank you very much for coming. I hope that's been interesting.